Hey everyone, how's it going? Oh wow, I'm loud. Cool. Hi, as Karan said, my name is Elly Wade, and I am part of the training team here at Maxon. And I promise you, I am slightly better at 3D than I am at making PowerPoint presentations. Yeah. So the idea of today's presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about simulation. But I'm going to talk about connecting those simulations together because those of you who work in 3D or know Cinema 4D will know that we recently updated the simulation system. And it's now a unified system, which means we can now combine all of the things like cloth, rigid bodies, rope simulations, and all of that stuff can interact together in the same scene. So we're going to talk about a few different things, combining soft and rigid bodies. Rigid bodies came out 2-3 days ago, Cinema 4D 2024. And then we're going to talk about why things like mass and topology are important. And then, of course, it wouldn't be me without doing a little bit of Redshift. And then if there's time, I've got another simulation, but we shall see. We'll see what happens. Okay, let me get into Cinema 4D. And we're going to start off. Actually, let me quickly show you. I put a few test scenes together, a few test renders earlier. And this is kind of the idea of what we're going to create first of all. Just this really nice, squishy, soft body combined with the rigid body, which is the logo in the middle. And then we're going to create this soft, squishy texture. I'm going to say squishy a lot, so I apologize now. Cool, so we're going to start off just by creating the base shape for the soft body. And we're going to keep it really nice and really simple, and we're going to make a cube. So anyone who comes into Cinema 4D, as soon as you make a cube, you're officially a Cinema 4D artist. So congratulations. I'm just going to resize this a little bit, maybe something like that. And I'm not too fussed about the size and the scaling. I'm going to leave it pretty big, because it's going to be connected to Cinema 4D's default scaling, which is nice, which is about 100 centimeters. So let's leave it like this. This is as high-tech as this gets. And if I just show my segments, I can see that we don't have a lot of topology. We don't have a very dense mesh going on. So I might need to just add some segments in here. So maybe let's go 80 by 12 by something like 150. And it's coming. So we can see we have a dense mesh going on. And this is going to be really important when it comes to creating simulations. We need to make sure we have enough points or enough polygons to then warrant all of the parameters that we're going to want to change. But a little tip here that I actually learned from Mikhail, who is Subframe Studios, is he creates a procedural setup using this method and a remesh and a connector, and it can work to update a polygon count or a point count of your simulated objects really easily. And so the way that we can do that is we can take our object, our cube, we can throw it into a remesh, and it won't really look any different at the moment. If we had not very nice looking topology, what the Z-remesher algorithm will do, thanks ZBrush, it will clean up that topology for us. But what I'm going to use it for is I'm going to change my target mode to polygon count, and then I can define the polygon count here for my mesh. And so what I can do, I can start low res, things are going to be really like fast and snappy, and then I can increase this over time because it's going to remain a procedural setup. So let's just, for now, go to like 8,000 on our polygon count. And then I'm also going to just throw this into a connect as well. So this is going to be my setup. This is my soft body. It's as simple as that. And let's start to actually add some squishiness. So let's not have a cube. Let's set up a... Oh, my pen's going a little bit weird. Technical problems. Love it. Cool, let's add a plane. So this is going to be our floor. And I'm just going to raise up the cube just so we don't have any intersections going on. And then let's just set up some simulations. So I'm going to right-click. I'm going to right-click on my connect, go to my simulation tags, and then we're going to add a soft body. So we can now see, we see a whole bunch of lines, a bunch of pink lines. These are our poles. And when we work with soft bodies, if I just come over to here, we can see that we have poles per point. Poles are constraints. What they're going to do is they're going to work to maintain the structural integrity of our shape. Basically, it's going to help keep it stiff or potentially squishy. And so what we want to do is we do actually want to have we want a lot of points because we want it to maintain its shape. But then we want to then adjust some other settings like softness, bendiness, stretchiness to bring back that squishy feeling. So what I'm going to do is, in my max poles per point, I'm going to change this to something like 25. And now we can see we have a lot of them now. And then we also have a spread value. So if this was at 0, what's happening is at each point, they're firing out a pole to the opposite point in the direction of the point normal. Basically, it's just looking in front of itself and going to the next point. The higher the spread, the more the angle they're going to come out and reach other points. So let's go something like 90. So we can now see we're almost filling that entire volume with these poles. And then we also then can bring more softness back in by just increasing this softness value here. So let's go something like 800. And so what I like to do when I say like, let's go 800, I just like to iterate. I like to just try things. And because simulation is now so fast and it's so well performing in Cinema 4D, I can just try values, press play. If it doesn't really work, I can then adjust those values and I continue to iterate as much as possible until I find something I'm happy with. Let's just add a collider to our floor. And then nothing's going to happen. So something's going to happen, but we're not really going to see anything. When I press play, we can't really see the soft body happening. So let's add a rigid body element to this as well. So let's just drop in a sphere. We're going to change this later on, but just for now, keep it nice and simple. Add a sphere, and then we can just right-click on our sphere, come into our simulation tags, and add a rigid body. So now when we press play, we can see that we're getting an element of softness and squishiness occurring now in our cube. So from here, we can start to make things a little bit more interesting by coming back into our cloth tag or our soft body tag, and then going to the surface tab. So the surface tab gives us all of the things that we need to also define and control the look of our simulation. And again, this is where things like topology is really important because all of these values, all of these constraints are based on the points that make up our the surface of our geometry. So just to run through a couple, bendiness, effectively, we'll look at the points around a single point, and it's how much they'll be allowed to bend. With a low value, we'll have a rigid sim. With a higher value, we'll have a bendy sim. Stretchiness is the points, so every other point, it's how far they're going to be allowed to stretch from one another. And then the rest are kind of, self-explanatory, bounciness, friction, etc. So we can use these settings to create a different looking sim, but all the time we're remembering that the mesh and the density of the topology is what really is making the difference. So let's maybe add, again, just some values that we like to play around with. I tend to always add a little bit of friction so we prevent objects from sliding around across each other. And then the thickness is the collision distance of objects when they collide. So I can do 1 centimeter, but if I had smaller objects, I would need a smaller value. And then we come to mass. And so mass is probably one of the most important things when it comes to connecting simulations together. And I didn't know this at first. And without having different masses, simulations become unpredictable. And we have errors, and it was kind of driving me crazy a little bit. And then I realized that actually having different objects with different masses will help fix so many problems, and things become more predictable. So let's just change our soft body mass to 5, and then my rigid body we're going to keep on a density or a mass of 1. Now let's play this through, and we can now see we're sort of getting a little bit more of a squishy feel. But how can we make this far better or far more interesting? Well, this is where we can come back into that remesh. So this is where we can control that polygon count really easily. And then we can just up this value. So let's go 15,000. And then what we will need to do, the important thing here, going back into our soft body, you'll notice that we're getting some problems in the corners. And that's because, again, this is basing the pose on the points. And because we change the number of points, because we up the polygon count, we need to actually refresh this. And now it's kicked back in, and now it's going to work correctly. And let's even up the softness as well. Why not? And now we can press. Okay, my pen is not working very well. Let's go back. Okay, I'm going to be track padding it now, everyone. I apologize. So let's just play this through. And so now we can see we're getting a little bit of a nicer looking soft body-ness in here. That's my new word. Okay, cool. So now let's actually go 25,000. Let's just up this. Let's go crazy. And then let's add a more interesting rigid body object. Let me just save this because why not? Right, so I'm a fan of working with logos and branding, so I thought I would just steal the Adidas logo for this. And we can paste that in here. So let's just set up a little bit of an interesting simulation. So let's do a 2x1x2. So what I'm doing is I'm just cloning the Adidas logo now. Let's raise that up, and then let's just pull it a little bit closer together. And then maybe we can transform this minus 90 and 90. There we go. Cool. So we're going to use these logos to replace the sphere. So we have some more interesting rigid body dynamics going on. And then we can start to really play around with the soft body just a little bit more. So let's pull that in there, and let's pull that down. And finally, just a little bit of variation with a random effector. This is like my go-to cloner setup. Something a little bit like this. And then we can add some varying rotation as well, just so they're going to fall at slightly different sort of angles. And then we can drop that rigid body tag that we'd originally made onto the sphere, onto my cloner. And then we can press play and just see how this reacts now. Okay, so everything's kind of collapsed in on itself. And the reason for that is because I changed the remesh without actually refreshing the pose. So now this should react slightly better. Play that through. And you can see it's still working really fast, even though we have really high dense meshes all working together. Okay, cool. So from here, the next step is we can actually combine soft body, rigid body with ballooning. So we can add a little bit of inflation now to this squishy pillow. And that's what's going to create those nice bubbles and those nice wrinkles as our rigid body Adidas logo comes down. So let's go into our soft body tag, go into ballooning, and we have the ability to enable ballooning. And then we have something called overpressure, which is kind of like inflation, but it's like a burst of pressure over a period of time, which is our expansion time. So let's say we have an overpressure of 1.5. So now this should slightly inflate as everything collides together. And so this is sort of what we have created. This little simulation here. And then as always, we can throw things into a subdivision surface and we can create some slightly interesting looking results. But again, another reason why I like working in this particular setup is because we can iterate fast, which is what we talked about at the beginning. So not only can I adjust my polygon count really quickly, but I can also come into my random and just start to play around with the seed. And so this just means my animation or my simulation, the way they fall will be slightly different, and I might find something that I'm happy with. Then I can just play it through. And then we just have something that looks a little bit like that. So maybe we can sort of pull them in just slightly, maybe a little bit like that, and play that through until we get something that we are a little bit happy with. Okay, so it's getting a little bit better, but there's a few things that I do actually want to fix and change, and those are going to be in my collisions of now my rigid body. So these are my logos falling down. So let's just increase that friction as well on those, and then maybe we can just reduce that thickness value for our collisions, and then we can hopefully prevent too much of a gap occurring. But before I press play, there's a couple of other things I do like to do. In my project settings, I can define a few things. So you might find when you work with simulations, especially when you're combining different types of simulations together, you might have collision problems or just different issues. You could have some jittering that we get sometimes where things aren't really falling properly and they're just kind of like wiggling. And those things we can fix inside of the simulation settings. So we can control substeps, but in this case, so substeps can work really well because they make the constraints and the simulation more precise. The downside in this case is increasing the substeps also adds to the stiffness and the rigidity of our simulation. So if I up the substeps, I'm no longer going to get a lot of that soft squishiness. So I need to figure out how I can fix these things without adjusting the substeps. And so we could add dampening. And I heard this described as adding dampening is like having your simulation occur underwater. So the more dampening you have, just the slower and smoother things are going to be. So let's maybe go 8%. And then we have collision passes, which can fix any of the intersections and the collisions that can occur without having to do the substeps. So let's play this through. And now we have these nice little sort of inflating, squishy lines that we can always come in and increase our subsurface on there. Subdivision surface, sorry. And then this is sort of how I created that particular inflating simulation. But there's more that we can do. We don't have to stop here. We can actually bake this down. And so what I would do is if I'm then going to go into Redshift, let's say you're satisfied with your animation and you don't need it to be continuously calculating. We can bake it down as an alembic, and then we can get into Redshift. We can do some texturing. But there's also some fun stuff we can do with an alembic to slow down and smooth out our animation. So in order to bake this as alembic, there's one thing I'm going to do first. I'm actually just going to drop everything into a connect. And what this will do is now when I bake it as an alembic, it will give me an individual file or individual object for this entire setup and this entire setup. Whereas when I tested without the connect, I was getting like 10 different objects for the cloner that was just harder to control. So this should just give me the one for each. So we have our Adidas logo. And we have our squishy pillow. Select them both. Actually, let's just save it. Select them both. Right click. And then bake as alembic. And this shouldn't take too long. Of course, depending on the number of frames, as well as the density of your mesh and like the complexity of your simulation, the longer this is going to take. If we just look in the little bottom left. So I don't worry about watching the far bit. I just kind of watch that one and see how long I have to fill time for live. And then once we have this, we will have our alembic, our cache data, which we can then slow down, and then we'll also be able to actually just disable this original simulation so it won't have to continue calculating. But at this point now, it's no longer procedural, so I can no longer come back and change my sim. Well, I can. I would just then have to rebake the simulation. So here we go. We've got this. We can see it's now in our scene. Is that me? Oh, God. Cool. And then what we can do is we can just group the original setup, hide that from our scene. We no longer need to see that. And then I'd also recommend just disabling your dynamics or your simulation tags, because sometimes that can just cause some problems. So now we have cached data. So I can actually scrub through the timeline and choose any frame that I like to then render out. And if you press play, we can see we have our simulation running in its original speed. But what we can do is there are more advanced and technical ways of creating slow motion animation, but I like fast hacks. That's kind of like my style. And so what we can do, we can just select the two alembics, and we can reduce the speed to something like 60%. And it just adds that little really easy slow motion effect onto this little sim here. Okay, so that is as advanced as that setup got. And now I'm going to just dive into one that's already got a lighting setup, so I can show you how I created that this kind of foamy, nice texture on there. So let's go to this one. Okay, yeah, cool. So it's the same thing. If I just come out of here, you can see that it is basically the exact same thing as before. It's just a cache sim. I slowed this one right down, so it's this nice sort of like slow-mo effect inside of here. And I just added the Nike and the Adidas logo because why not? Cool. So with this bit done, we can now look at how I created the texture for this. And this is a procedural texture. I like to work with procedural textures. One, because I get to basically explore my own creativity and create a unique material that someone else may not have. And also, when you work with texture maps, we have to sometimes either do like a triplanar effect or we have to UV things, but I like to work and iterate fast and create fast setups. And so working procedurally is a really great way of doing that. So let's just come in here and let's reduce this down just to make things a little bit faster. So we go low, and then we've got in our system, yeah, that's fine. We can work with that. And let's just take these materials off. Let's take that off, and then take these off as well. We want to start from scratch. Okay, cool. So we have our plain scene here. The only thing it has got is it's already got some redshift lighting in it. So I can just quickly show you what that is. I'll just switch these off. Really simple lighting setup. It is a dome light with a HDR image. And then I just like to add a few different area lights just to highlight some of the darker areas, and it will help bring out the texture and the detail as well. So let's create that. Let's create that material. Let's throw that on our squishy pillow, and then let's start to create some stuff. Okay, so this is, I've just created a redshift standard material, and this is the base of that. We have our standard material node, and we have our output, which is outputting to the surface. And the main focus of this material is to be creating elements of detail and texture to really help sell that soft body feel in a procedural way. So first of all, let's just create a sort of a slightly creamy color here. Yeah, that looks fine. And I'm not going to change anything else in the base settings. But what I am going to do is I'm going to begin to use Maxon noises to create my own version of a texture map for bump and displacement. So if I double click, we actually have access to Maxon noises inside of Redshift materials. Just pull that in here, and we can solo this. So the little S key there is going to show me how this noise is projecting onto the surface of my object. Let's just make it a little bit bigger so everyone can see. Cool. So this is the algorithm or the noise pattern that we can see. What I found was Voronoi 1 gives this really cool like cellular pattern. What we can do, we can tweak it and we can combine it with other versions of itself to create a really interesting cell-like material or pattern, which we can then use for our detail. So let's just come into our output. And in our output, we can just define a few different settings. So maybe we can just increase our cycles to something like 1.5. And then we can, our low clip, as we increase our low clip, you'll notice that the darker or the blacks become more prominent. And then we can do the opposite with the high clip, and we can pull those down. So we almost just have these little cells, these little dots in here. And then maybe we can decrease our contrast because we don't necessarily want to have 100% black and white values, because then we could get too intense of a displacement going on. So that's the first noise. And then what we can do is we can just layer these up and duplicate them to create our own version of our own Maxon noise. So if I just duplicate that, solo this one, maybe make them a little bit smaller, and then maybe just adjust the seed so we get a different sort of like random distribution. And then one more time, we can then solo that, and again, just make them a little bit smaller on the scale, and then maybe we can adjust the seed again. So we now have this one, and this one. And now we just have to combine them together. And the way that we do that is double click, add a color layer. So color layer it's like baby Photoshop. Basically, we have a color option, so we can input like a color, a texture, a noise, whatever we want. Then we have a mask, similar to a Photoshop layer mask. We can then apply a black and white texture or a grayscale texture to show and hide certain things. And then we have our blending modes. So if we just now solo the color layer, let's just make sure, like we don't need that, we can hide all this stuff away. You can layer up to 8 different things. We have the base layer, first noise, layer 1, second noise, layer 2, third noise. We just have to enable all of those, and then we can connect them to the relevant color input. So I literally just plug these into the color here. So we got 1, 2, 3 colors. And then we just need to do our magical Photoshop blending, and then just multiply these together. And then now what we have is a far more interesting version of the Maxon noise, which we can use as our surface detail or our surface textures. So how do we do that? Well, let's just give ourselves a little bit of room over here. All we have to do is we have to tell Redshift, hey, this little setup here, can you please see it as a bump map or a displacement map? And the way that we do that is we take a bump map node. Let's do a displacement as well. Take a displacement node. All I'm doing is drag and dropping these in. And then, just get rid of that. We can unsolo that, connect these together, and then we can connect it into, we have a little bump map input on our standard material. And now, hopefully it's visible for everyone. I'm going to leave it really kind of, maybe a little bit too intense, just so then like live stream and everyone can see it. But yeah, basically what we're doing is we've cut these little holes out to create this surface detail. But at the moment, it's just a bump map, so it's just a kind of height effect. If I zoomed in really close, you will see that we're not actually getting any physical displacement. So what we can do is we can just throw it also into a displacement node and then plug that in here. And then at the moment, nothing happens because there's a quick little extra step we need to take. So on the squishy pillow object, I just need to add a redshift object tag. And then in geometry, we can override that, enable tessellation, which is subdivision. And then we can also just enable add displacement. And it might be a little bit crazy. Oh, it's actually not too bad. That's not too bad, but let's maybe decrease that a little bit and make sure it's working. Give a little refresh. Cool, so now we have the bump and the displacement working to add this nice little, this texture effect. But there is more. We can do more. Let's reopen our material. And so I like to spend a lot of time in materials. It's something I like to do. But you could be happy with this. We could be satisfied. But something that can go a long way, especially in textures like this, when it comes to like I was thinking like marshmallow textures was kind of my like inspiration for this. And so a little bit of subsurface can go a long way, especially to bring out these sort of darker patches in the creases. So the way that we do that is back into our original standard material node, we can come down to subsurface. Subsurface basically is when the light hits our object, it's going to absorb that light and it's going to scatter it inside based on these values. So the first thing I'll do is I'm just going to copy the color, the base color that I set up, and I'm going to paste that in the subsurface just so the color matches. And then the weight value inside of Redshift, a lot of settings will have a weight value. It's effectively at 0, it's off. So we have no subsurface at the moment. Anything above 0 will start to combine with the other settings like base color, reflection, etc. So let's just do like a 0.5. We don't want to have like a crazy amount of subsurface. And then the scale is the next most important thing. So the scale is how far into the volume or into the object that the light is going to travel and then scatter. This is based in centimeters for Cinema 4D. And so understanding the size of your object when working with subsurface is really important. So we know this was 200 by 30 by 400 centimeters. So a scale of 1 maybe isn't really going to do a great job. So let's scatter 5 centimeters into our object. And now we can see it's lightened up those areas, and it just gives that kind of extra little softness with the subsurface. Okay, we're doing good for time. Okay, let's do a little part 2 of this material. So at the moment, what we have is this set up here. So we've created the little dents in the surface of our material, but the more noises you combine and the more kind of color layers you use, just the nicer and the better the material will look. And so what I thought I would do was just copy this entire setup. So we can copy and paste it. Again, I like to keep things like fast. And then we can just reverse the colors for the Maxon noise. So at the moment we have black and then white. So up here we have black and then white. And so if we just reverse these, so let's maybe do like an off-white and then a off-black, and then maybe just change the seed so it's not the exact same as its counterpart. And then we can just do that again. And then what this is going to do is when we then use this as the bump and displacement, instead of it being indented, it's going to be raised. So again, just adding a little bit more detail to the surface of our objects. Here we go, let's do that. And you change the seed just a little bit, just random values. And then we'll also need to change the blending mode. So because we now have slightly darker noises, we need to just make sure we adjust this so we get something that looks a little bit like that. So it's kind of the opposite of what we had before. And then all we have to do is tell Redshift, again, we just need a bump map so we can see this as a bump and displacement texture map. And then we can connect these together into our input. Just in there. But now the trouble is we only have one input for bump and one input for displacement. So how can we combine these things together? Well, if we just give ourselves, again, a little bit more room, we can actually blend things together. We can use Blender, 3D joke, So let's get a bump blender and let's get a displacement blender. And we'll just combine these together. Also, for anyone who joined later on, if you're wondering why I'm a little bit slow, my pen tablet's not working, so I'm on the trackpad. But it's okay. I'm a pro. So let's just connect this into the bump map. And then let's unsolo this. So in the bump blender, we have our different layer options, kind of similar to the color layer. We have a blend weight. So as we know, we just need to up that weight value. And then we also have additive mode. So it's just going to add these two bumps on top of each other. And then what we should have is we'll have detail on the outside and detail now going on the inside. And then we can just do the same thing with the displacement. Again, just some random values in here. And then if I just, tell you what, if I switch off the subsurface, you should be able to see this a little bit better. Let me hit a little refresh on there. So now, hopefully you can see that there are now dents on the inside and bumps on the outside. Again, just helping to like sell this as a nice texture here. Okay, cool. So we got some time. So if I just switch subsurface back on and then just kick that off. This was basically how I created that material. I added some extra little noise elements as well. And then I did come in and we can use, so we have different diffuse model types. Basically, the Lambertian spheres it's great for like porous materials. So we can again add and make a really a more rough looking material for this. Again, that makes it just give it that nice texture. That's what I like to do. I like to try and create nice textures procedurally. And yeah, this was the basics of how I created that texture and that simulation. And so what I do want to do, because I've got a little bit of time left, I do want to do another quick setup, which talks about, again, connecting simulations together. So let's just get rid of that. Let's go to this little basketball hoop and hide that away. Okay, let's get into here. So when I was doing some tests for connecting simulations together, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun to create a basketball hoop with a basketball net that's a simulation where the basketball can now go through and interact with the net nice and fun. So in the next, hopefully, 8 minutes, I will show how to do that nice and quickly. So I'm going to start off just by creating the net shape. And to do that, I'm just going to create a cone, center it into the middle of the hoop, and then adjust some of these settings. Let's go 12 and 20, 22. 22. There we go, that's what I need. And the height of 50. And let's just reposition this down. And then we can see our segments and our subdivisions. So again, we know from the last simulation that our density in the topology is really important. But it's even more important for this because I'm going to convert the lines that make up the geometry into the net spline. So let's go something like this, maybe like 32. And this is going to become our net. And let's just pull that cone out of there. There we go. And then hit C, and C is going to turn it from a parametric object to a polygonal object. And the reason that is good and handy is because now I can just delete this top loop. I can just grab all of those, delete them, come to the bottom, grab all of those and delete them. And then with my lines selected, or my edges, I can just go Command A to select them all. And then Shift C opens up the commander. And so if you remember a feature but you don't know where it is, Shift C and you can search for it. And we can do edge to spline. And what this will do is if I just come down here, it now separates the spline. So if I delete the cone, we now just have the net, a spline version of the net, which we can then add our rope dynamics to. So let's add a floor as well, just so we can show off some other stuff. Add a little floor here. Let's maybe make that black, just so everyone can see it. There we go. And then let's just, on our spline, on our new little net that we created, we can add a rope tag. And then we can press play. Let's just add a collider. And we press play. And everything explodes into loads of tiny little noodles, which isn't exactly what we want. We're kind of hoping for a little bit more of a basketball net vibe. So what we can do is we can take advantage of some of the connectors and the different tags in the simulation system. So we need this to be an individual mesh, an individual net. So let's right-click, simulation tags, and then grab a connector. What connector is going to do, again, looks at the points, that's important, and it's going to define a search radius, and it's going to try and find a point within that radius, and it's going to kind of hold on to it like this. They're all going to hold on and be like, guys, I'm not going to let you fall. So let's just increase that radius to something like 4, and then the connections, the more connections, the stronger they're going to be. That's what we need. And then we don't want other objects, because what that will do is it will connect itself to other simulated objects. We want the same object, and we want to update it live. So now when we press play, we now have, hopefully you can see, a net that's all together. We no longer have our separate little noodles. But still not really right, because we kind of want it to connect to the hoop. So how do we do that? Well, there's 2 different ways of doing it. The first way is we could actually fix points in space. So I could select the top loop, and then I could fix those. But the downside is if I then moved the basketball hoop, the net's going to stay in place and the hoop's going to move around. So I can actually connect it or belt it onto the ring of the hoop. So then if I chose to animate the hoop, the net and the simulation is going to kind of move along with it. So let's do that. So we right-click, and then we grab, in our simulation tags, the rope belt. We also have, so this entire setup also works for cloth, because the connect we wouldn't need the connect, but it could work the same way. But then if you want to connect cloth to something, just use the cloth belt. So let's grab the rope belt, and it needs a few things. So first of all, it needs the object, and it needs to be a polygonal object. It needs to be actual geometry to connect onto, which is just going to be that top ring, that top hoop there. And I was actually organized enough to name the object that I needed. So I can just drop in the rope belt object. And then I need the points that are going to be connected to the hoop. So if I just hide this, I can, oh, it's in there, isn't it? Let's not hide that then. Let's come into our spline. Let's zoom in here. And then let's just go to rectangle selection with my points. This is important. And then we can just grab those top points. And then back in my rope belt, I can go to set. And they've all gone red. And now, magically, it is all connected. Well, it's not magic, it's just Cinema 4D. So finally, I've got a couple minutes left. So, I mean, it wouldn't be a basketball hoop without a basketball actually falling through it and interacting. So let's do that as well. Let's grab the floor, get rid of that. Don't need you anymore. And just for speed, I'm going to keep it nice and simple by grabbing a sphere. And let's shrink this down. And let's drop this sphere into this little like torus hoop, just so I can center it correctly. Pull that down, make it maybe a little bit bigger, so we know it's going to fit through. And then pull that out of the hoop. Okay, so the way that we get this to work is kind of similar to the Adidas logo when we had that combined with the soft body sim. We just need to add a rigid body simulation tag. And then we can press play. And it kind of doesn't really work. The net's like, no, sorry, you're not having the 3 points. And so this is where, again, the math is really important. So I just need to come into my rope sim And I just need to adjust and reduce the mass of the rope to enable the rigid body sphere to fall through. And that's as simple as that. That's how we can create a rope, a net, a sim, have it belt onto the basketball hoop, and then have our little basketball going through. So sometimes live, you don't come across the problems when you practice. And so I do like to talk about that a little bit. If, let's say, you were still having problems, collisions, intersections, that's where we come in to our simulation settings. Then we can up things like our sub-steps. We can up things like our collision passes, some dampening, just to help fix any of those problems. And then I guess one final little thing, we can do a little 1 minute. We can turn this into geometry with one of our favorite generators, the sweep. So if we throw it into a sweep, we can then define the shape of the net, which is just going to be a nice circle, maybe like 0.1. And then we can drop that a bit further down into here. And now NA. We now have some actual physical geometry for our net. And we can all be playing now in the NBA. Yeah, cool. So apologies for all my jokes and the fact that I've had to use a trackpad this entire time. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.